Yeah, welcome to our today's lecture. It is a great honor for me to welcome Hanétha Vété-Congolo, who unfortunately for some unforeseen circumstances cannot be present here in Hildesheim, but she was a guest in Hildesheim several times already. And yeah, we are very happy that given the circumstances, you are still able to deliver this lecture here today online. Let me introduce Professor Hanétha Vété-Congolo to you. She is Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures at Bowdoin College in the United States. And she is a very active scholar with very many publications, but she is also a poet, what is not unimportant given the topic of today, Negritude, philosophical, literary movement. Hanétha has a long and very active academic career already. She served as the president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and she is the founder of several organizations and institutes, including the network of researchers from Guadeloupe, French Guyana, and Martinique in the United States. As a native of Martinique, she is, of course, fluent in French, English, and also in Creole. She has published extensively on the philosophy of the Caribbean, with a particular focus on women in the Caribbean, as well as orality and oral philosophies in the Caribbean and in Africa. She is an expert in the Negritude movement. And Martinique, a relatively small island in the Caribbean, has been, as you know, the birthplace of so many prominent scholars and intellectuals, including Frantz Fanon, Aimé, Césaire, the Nardal sisters, or also Edouard Glissant, and Hanétha Vété-Congolo. Let me mention just a few of her recent publications. In 2020, she published Nous sommes Martiniquais, Paroles en bouche des femmes châtaignées, une pensée existentialiste noire sur la question des femmes. In 2016, she published a book on the Caribbean oral tradition, literature, performance, and practices. And in 2015, she published a book on Léon Gontran, Damas, one of the very famous representatives also of the Negritude. Furthermore, Hanétha plays an invaluable role as a member of our editorial team for the 8-volume publication project on the history of philosophies of Africa, which will be published in Schwabe Publishing House in Switzerland. Since we consider the Negritude movement as core for the topic of transatlantic resonances, we are very grateful that Hanétha will talk today about Longue Durée Négritude, thinking the movement beyond the 20th century. Hanétha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anka. I thank you really for this invitation, you along with your collaborators, and I appreciate that many of you have taken the time and travel to be present for that moment of exchange around Caribbean thought, and especially around the intervention of Africans within Caribbean thought, within the building of and sustenance of Caribbean thought. So I want to depart from a Negritude in the way it was thought by Caribbeans, namely Damas and Césaire, but for today, I am going to concentrate on Césaire's perspective on Negritude and start with reminding us what he says about Negritude in relation to Haiti. Here is what he says. Haiti, where Negritude stood up for the very first time and said that she believed in her humanity. So this affirmation is often read as marking a point of origin, as though Negritude were brought into being at a moment when enslaved Africans overturned the colonial order and declared themselves human before the world. Such a reading presupposes that humanity requires an inaugural moment of affirmation in order to exist, and that historical visibility coincides with ontological emergence. And it's precisely this presupposition that I want to interrogate. So Césaire's formulation displays this logic. So the act of standing up does not institute being. It recognizes its conditions of appearance. And what is at stake in Haiti is this passage from a mode of existence deprived of legibility to one that imposes itself as visible, as audible, and historically undeniable. So this is what the Africans in the colony of Haiti accomplished. And as we are at this entrance, the entrance of this reflection, I want us to bear in mind that the Haitian Revolution is actually an African revolution. The majority of those who led that revolution were born in Africa. So Negritude, in this sense, does not begin there. It reaches a threshold at which it can no longer be contained within invisibility. And so to contextualize, I want to introduce what I call the plantasiological. So to me, the plantasiological is the structuring logic through which the plantation produces ontological, social, and symbolic order. And that is very important to understand what will unfold. So what is crucial here is that Césaire already operates with the knowledge that humanity under the plantasiological conditions is not given as self-evident. His insistence that Haiti believed in her humanity does not suggest uncertainty about being. It points to a configuration in which humanity must be posited as an act precisely because it is structurally refused as a fact. Belief here does not compensate for absence. It performs being against a regime that seeks to render it untenable. So we're talking about enslavement here. So if humanity must be asserted, it must be already operative prior to its assertion. The act of standing up presupposes a prior persistence that does not depend on recognition in order to exist. What Haiti accomplishes is therefore the reorganization of the field in which humanity can appear as itself as such. And to follow this logic to its full consequences, to displace the temporal frame. So to me, if Negritude becomes historically legible in Haiti, it must be structurally anterior to that moment. So it coincides with the conditions that make such a declaration necessary. The plantasiological regime itself, from the moment Africans are captured, deported, and inserted into a system that disqualifies them as human, the question of humanity is forced into a new mode of existence. So within this configuration, being does not await recognition to occur. It persists as that which cannot be eliminated, even as its conditions of affirmation are systematically dismantled. Knowledge does not require authorization to function. It emerges from experience, it circulates, it produces effects, even when it is excluded from legitimacy. Subjectivity does not depend on confirmation to exist. It is maintained in a fractured mode, that's certainly the case for these Africans here, without the reciprocity through which it would ordinarily stabilize itself. These are not residual survivals, they are active modalities of existence under duress. So what emerges here is not simply resistance within domination, but the enactment of an ontology that does not depend on recognition. The enslaved are not positioned outside being, knowledge, and subjectivity. They are forced to enact them without access to the structures that would ordinarily validate them. So recognition appears in this light as a contingent regime of distribution, of visibility, legitimacy, and confirmation, and not as the ground of existence itself. So my claim is that it is in this sense that Césaire's gesture must be situated. Césaire renders explicit a structure that had already been operative. His articulation of Negritude condenses and elevates a set of practices through which the enslaved had long been persisting as beings, producing knowledge and sustaining subjectivity in the absence of recognition. The Haitian Revolution makes this historically undeniable. In other words, Césaire knows that Negritude precedes him. However, while he marks the moment which to him it took, say, a formal aspect through the Haitian Revolution, I aim at showing its regular manifestations prior to this historical and well-defined moment. It ensures that from this perspective, both Césaire and his enslaved ancestors participate in the elaboration of a Caribbean epistemology grounded in the experience of ontological disqualification. The enslaved enact this epistemology in practice through various means, resistance, transmission, organized action, and so forth, while Césaire formulates it at the level of discourse and concept. What connects them is a shared engagement with a problem imposed by the pentasological. That is, how being continues where its conditions of recognition are withdrawn. That is one of the questions that the experience of enslavement arouses and actually provokes to these Africans. To situate Negritude within this continuity is to reposition it within a longue durée that precedes its naming. It does not emerge at the moment it speaks. It becomes audible there at that moment. Long before Haiti, and from the very inception of the plantasological order, a form of life is already in operation, one in which humanity is enacted without recognition, as I said, knowledge is produced without legitimacy, and subjectivity is maintained without confirmation. Césaire gives this configuration language. His African ancestors had already established Negritude as a regime of truth precisely within the site where truth and meaning were constituted as strict reflections of the plantasological's unethical order. So now, what is the context within which these Africans are enslaved? Two major aspects are going to be underlined here. So the first one is the physical aspect. So the what sustains the plantasological is violence, and in its two major forms, the physical form, which is systematic, and the metaphysical form, which is also systematic. And I'm giving an example of each form so that we understand the context within which my proposition is articulated. So here is what Xavier Tanque, who is a French visitor of the colony of Martinique in the 18th century, says. He says, a slave to the eyes of the enslavers is not a man. And man here means human person. So a slave to the eyes of the enslaver is not a human person. The statement reveals that dehumanization operates first as a practical orientation. And I should say the attempt to dehumanize, because I do not believe that enslavers did what no human being can ever do, which is to extirpate out of the human person their humanity. So they did not dehumanize the Africans. They attempted to dehumanize. And today I am a living proof that they did not succeed at dehumanizing them. So this statement operates first as a practical orientation. To say that the enslaved is not a man in the eyes of the enslaver is to identify a specific regime of perception through which all actions towards the enslaved are filtered. The denial of humanity is not a theoretical proposition, it is a condition for acting in a certain way. In other words, the ideology is operational. It allows, it justifies, it organizes practices such as punishment, exploitation, mutilation, control, and so forth. And without this prior perceptual framing, the acts described by Tank would be impossible to sustain. The plantation system requires a form of labor that presupposes human capacities, which is intelligence, coordination, endurance, and so forth, while at the same time, it reduces the enslaved to the status of an instrument. And this creates a structural contradiction. The enslaved must be treated as capable, yet they cannot be recognized as such. Tank's formulation shows how this contradiction is resolved. It's resolved by instituting a regime in which the enslaved is seen as non-being. This perception makes it possible to inflict continuous violence without collapsing into moral contradiction. The ideology thus functions as a condition of possibility for the plantasiological itself. The statement is not a man, is not a human person, must be taken its full ontological force. It does not simply designate a lower legal or social status. It operates as a disqualification of being. The enslaved is not merely denied rights. They are positioned outside the category within which those rights would make sense. They are not subjects whose humanity is limited. They are constructed as beings for whom the category of the human does not apply. And this disqualification is what allows all subsequent practices to appear coherent within the plantasiological. The body can be opened, it can be torn, chained, and it is because it's not recognized as the body of a subject. The enslaver's ideology does not merely misrepresent the enslaved, it actively participates in producing the reality it claims to describe. By subjecting the enslaved to conditions of extreme violence, the plantasiological generates behaviors such as fear, dependence, exhaustion, and so forth, that can then be read as signs of inferiority. What appears as a pre-existing condition is in fact the result of a process. The enslaved are not naturally reduced, they are systematically reduced. Ideology in this sense is very performative because it creates the conditions under which its claims appear self-evident. If the structure within which the enslaved exist systematically denies their humanity, then the conditions for self-recognition are profoundly destabilized. To exist in a world that does not acknowledge one as a subject is to be forced into a position when one's own being is not confirmed by the surrounding order. This produces a fundamental rupture as the subject cannot fully coincide with themselves within the terms imposed by the plantasiological. The external denial of humanity reverberates internally, not necessarily as explicit self-rejection, but as a condition in which the self cannot be affirmed without contradiction. And so within this framework, the devaluation of African practices and the imposition of colonial norms take on a deeper significance. So this is one of the consequences of that aspect of the plantasiological. And so if the enslaved are already positioned outside the category of the human, and if access to recognition is mediated exclusively by the forms of the dominant order, then the subject is progressively led to distance themselves from their own modes of being. So this here is one aspect of the manifestations of physical violence. And the As to the axiological, ontological violence, here is what I propose. I do have a very long quotation that I will not read for the sake of time, but it also comes from Tank, the same observer, who recounts his experience in the plantation where he collects the enslavers' thoughts, their ideology regarding the enslaved. And in that, it transpires violence, of course, and especially the combination of this physical violence and metaphysical violence. So the body of the enslaved, so he witnesses an enslaved being whipped, and his flesh being taken out of his body through the strokes of the lash. So the enslaved is literally defleshed. This is what he sees. And to that is combined a mental and psychic effect that leads about what I call an axiological, ontological violence here. And so what is at stake here in this scene that he's describing is not cruelty in a moral sense. It's not even violence in a descriptive sense. It is the very structure of the plantaciological as a regime which central operation is not simply domination, but the systematic production of a being deprived of its integrity as body, as subject, and as world. In this description, the violence, of course, is not incidental. It is organized and it's clear. It's systematic, it's repeated, it's calibrated, it's really well thought out, and it is collectively staged because multiple enslaved people are being whipped together, and the enslaved are not merely beaten, they are exposed, they are aligned in multiple ways because there are many of them, and they are processed actually through violence. And so this sequence itself is very significant. One body is designated, then another, then several, until the plurality of bodies becomes a series. The blows are not chaotic, they follow an order. The command is given, the execution follows, the repetition ensures that the act is not an exception, but a rule. What is produced here is not spectacle alone, it is structured. And the description insists on the material of the body. So you have bits of flesh that actually fly in the air, the blood that's running, the lash that's with its noise, and all that onto the body. And so this insistence must be taken literally because this is a visual scene. He's actually witnessing this. The plantaciological regime does not simply strike the body, it dismembers it. It separates flesh from form, continuity from fragmentation. The body ceases to appear as a coherent whole and instead becomes a site of tearing, dispersal, and extraction. What is attacked is precisely the unity that would allow the subject to experience itself as one. At the same time, this violence is not limited to the physical dimension. It is directed at the sensory and affective structure of the subject. The blows are applied with no distinction regarding the intimate organs, the intimate parts of the body. That is, with the intent to invade the entire field of sensation. Pain is generalized across the body. It is not localized, it is totalized. The presence of others, the young, old people, enslaved people, ensures that the suffering is not individual, but it is shared, that the body of each is exposed to the suffering of all. What is produced here is a collective field of terror, in which each body becomes both the site and the mirror of the destruction of the others. This is why the scene must be understood in ontological terms. The violence does not only aim at inflicting physical pain, it aims at the destruction of the conditions under which a subject can inhabit their own body. To be beaten in this way is to be progressively torn away from oneself, to be forced into a state in which the body is no longer experienced as a ground of agency, but as a surface of inscription for the will of the other. One might say more precisely that the enslaved subject is here subjected to a process of defleshing, not because the body disappears, but because it is stripped of its coherence, of its boundaries even, of its capacity to sustain a relation to itself. The body remains, but it's no longer a body for itself. It becomes a body for the plantasiological, a body that is penetrated and reorganized by violence. This is reinforced by the continuation of the punishment beyond the moment of beating, because the enslaver gives the order to prolong the beating. The order, so they instruct the overseer to apply onto the wounds, so onto the body, the defleshed body, hot pepper, so that prolongs, so that the pain be prolonged, and to actually imprison those who've been beaten. So this shows that the violence is not episodic, but it's continuous. It extends into time. Pain is prolonged, it's maintained, and it's constantly reactivated. The wound is not allowed to close. It is deliberately reopened. The plantasiological ensures that the body remains in a state of injury. And in this sense, violence is not an event, it is a condition. The plantasiological then appears as a regime of permanent aggression in which the body of the enslaved is continuously exposed to processes of fragmentation, excitation, and control. One cannot understand such a system if one reduces it to exploitation or labor extraction. Its fundamental operation is ontological. It produces a being whose relation to itself is destabilized, whose corporeality is constantly attacked, whose sensory world is saturated with imposed pain. To say that Africans in the plantation are defleshed is therefore not metaphorical. It is a precise description of a process in which the integrity of the body is systematically undone. The flesh is literally torn. The body is reduced to a field of wounds. The subject is forced into a relation to itself mediated by violence. This is not excess. It is the pillar of the plantasiological. The plantation does not function despite violence. It functions through violence. And it is within this structure, this regime of constant and total violence, that any act of persistence, any act of thought, any act of refusal on the part of the African must be understood. For if, so I'll come back to that. I'll spare this for the end. So now, what are the consequences of that plantasiological, this regime mounted on violence, on total violence, within which the African who is enslaved experiences what is supposed to be life? So Labat is a missionary, Jean-Baptiste Labat, a French missionary in the 17th century, who says this: all the Negroes love appearance. They love being well-dressed, especially when they go to church. So this is his statement. And so this observation must be approached in a certain way, so as we avoid reducing it to a superficial logic of imitation, because what they love being dressed, the only elements of the plantation that are dressed are the enslavers, because the enslaved Africans are most of the time naked. So they would be imitating the enslaver. The enslavers are Catholic, they go to church very religiously, and the enslaved do love going to church to be well dressed. This is what Laba is telling us. So the question of imitation appears here. It is right there at the surface, but we need to look at this in a with more rigor, I would say. So, because what is disclosed is not a desire to resemble the enslaver, but a transformation in the conditions under which humanity itself becomes perceptible. The enslaved subject is first produced as dispossessed. They are naked, I said earlier, and so their nakedness here is not an incidental state, it is an ontological positioning. To be unclothed is not merely to lack covering, but to be situated outside the field within which one can appear as human. Exposure is thus not simply physical, it is the enforced visibility of a being denied the status of subject. It is the plantasiological that imposes nakedness here on the part of the enslaved Africans. So within this configuration, clothing does not function as ornament or preference. It operates as a threshold of legibility. To appear dressed, particularly within institutional spaces such as the church, is to enter provisionally, at least, into a regime in which one can be minimally recognized as inhabiting the category of the human. It is not a recovery of dignity, but access to its conditions of appearance. Yet these conditions are not endogenous. They are defined, they are controlled and monopolized by the same structure, by the plantasiological, that produces dispossession. What emerges, therefore, is not a restoration of self, but a forced passage through externally imposed forms. The subject cannot appear as human except by aligning, at least partially, with norms that are not their own. These are the norms of the plantasiological, whereby you must be dressed to be fully human. So humanity becomes mediated. It's not immediate. At this point, the process must be understood not as adaptation, but as ontological displacement. When African practices are designated as infâme, and when the only available forms of recognition are structured by the dominant order, the subject is placed in a condition where its own modes of being no longer coincide with what can be recognized as human. This is not a matter of choice. It is the effect of a structure that recognizes the very conditions under which being can appear. What follows is not imitation in any meaningful sense. Imitation presupposes equivalence between forms. Here, no such equivalence exists. The plantasiological monopolizes recognition such that legitimacy is accessible only through specific and imposed configurations. The movement toward these configurations is therefore not elective, it is constrained. It's the navigation within a field in which the conditions of appearance are externally fixed. So over time, this produces a displacement in the subject's relation to himself. What had been and this is what François is going to explain to us much later, what had been a mode of existence is recoded as insufficiency. What had been a form of life becomes unintelligible within the dominant regime. The result is not necessarily explicit rejection of oneself, but a structural non-coincidence. The subject must inhabit forms that grant recognition while being separated from those through which it had historically existed. And this displacement must be understood in ontological terms as well. The issue is not cultural loss alone. It is the reorganization of the relation between being and their conditions of affirmation. The subject does not simply lose practices. They lose the capacity to have those practices function as grounds of recognizability. And in this sense, the plantasiological does not only dispossess, it renders certain modes of being uninhabitable as human. So when what emerges with clarity here is that the enslaved subject does not evolve within a neutral, of course, or merely coercive framework, but under a regime of heavy, radical, and structurally violent imposition. This violence is at once physical and more, like I shown, in that it seeks to reconfigure the very condition of selfhood, of value and being. It is therefore not episodic brutality, but a total violence, one that penetrates and organizes existence at every level. And fundamentally, it is deliberately sustained and methodically prolonged. So this idea of the pain being inflicted for it to last beyond the time of infliction is very important, because this concerns us today. That is the pain that continues today. It was organized in the plantation, and the plantation order depends on that continuity. The violence inflicted upon the enslaved is consciously designed to endure, to reproduce itself across time, and to stabilize the very structures that necessitate it. In this sense, it is a programmed violence. It's oriented towards permanence. And such durability necessarily augurs a complex and deeply stratified future, particularly for the offspring of the enslaved. What is transmitted is not only a social condition, but the layered effects of this dual violence, the corporeal and moral violence, whose imprint reorganizes kinship, subjectivity, and the conditions of self-apprehension. The future is therefore marked in advance by this inheritance, a space where distortion, alienation, persistence, and reconstitution must be fought together as the consequences of the violence that was always intended to last. So now, Césaire, what is Negritude and how does he define it? So this historical condition here that I described, that is its long effects into post-enslavement, the post-enslavement period, prompted Césaire's intervention. And he defines Negritude in apparently simple terms, right? All right, so Negritude is the recognition, is the acknowledgement, according to Césaire, of the fact of being Black and the fact of accepting that fact, our destiny as Black people, and of our history and our culture. That is one definition he applies to Negritude. So this formulation here emphasizes recognition. It speaks of consciousness, acceptance, relation to history. But this is only one layer of the concept. In his Discours sur la Négritude, Discourse on Negritude, a discourse he gave at the University in Florida in 1987, he expands and radicalizes this definition. Negritude is not a philosophy, so I'm going to read the Césaire's definition. Negritude arises from an active and combative stance of the mind. It is an upsurge of dignity. It is refusal of oppression. It is struggle, that is to say, struggle against inequality. It is also revolt. He also says, all right, let's go back. Negritude is not a philosophy. It's not a metaphysics. It's a way of experiencing history within history. Negritude results from an active and offensive disposition of the mind. It is an upsurge of dignity and refusal and a combat, a fight. And it is also revolt, as I just read. So these this statement is fundamental. It shifts Negritude away from identity and towards practice. Negritude is not a doctrine. It's not an abstract system, according to Césaire. It's an active relation to historical violence. It is refusal, it is combat. It is an uprising of dignity within conditions that deny dignity. And so this becomes even clearer when one returns to Césaire's famous formulation on Haiti. Haiti, where Negritude stood up for the very first time and said that she believed in her humanity. This sentence must be read with philosophical attention. What Haiti affirms is not simply freedom, not even in identity. It is her belief in her own humanity. This is crucial. It implies that humanity in the context of the plantasiological is no longer a self-evident condition, like I showed. It is not simply given. It is something that can be denied, withdrawn, or rendered incredible. This is the plantasiological ideology. And so to say that Haiti believed in her humanity is to indicate that the plantation had produced a world in which such belief had become necessary. Humanity itself had been placed in question. In practice, not in theory, humanity was really questioned in the plantation. The enslaved were not merely dominated, they were situated outside the domain in which human being could be recognized or affirmed, as I showed. And under these conditions, to affirm one's humanity is not redundant. It is an act. It is a wager against a structure that has made such affirmation appear impossible. Belief here must not be understood as illusion, but as a performative ontological stance. To believe in one's humanity is to posit oneself as human in a world that refuses this position, and thereby to begin to reconfigure the conditions of the human itself. Haiti does not discover her humanity. She asserts it against this historical suspension. Once this dimension is acknowledged, Césaire's broader definition of Negritude takes on its full force. Recognition and acceptance are not primary givens. They are responses to a prior disqualification. He describes the fight, the refusal, the dignity he describes are precisely the forms for which this belief becomes effective. Negritude is therefore not merely the affirmation of identity, but the active reconstitution of humanity at the very point where it has been denied. And so from this perspective, Haiti does not mark an origin. Haiti marks a moment of visibility. If Negritude is an active refusal, if she is a combat, a manner of living history under conditions of ontological violence, then the question arises whether such practices truly begin at that moment, or whether Haiti is the point at which what had long been enacted becomes explicit. Describing plantation violence or ideology is not enough, like I did. I did describe the two forms of violence that were inflicted upon the enslaved Africans. So for this plantation configuration, so for the plantasiological, destabilizes fundamental physical philosophical categories. This is what the plantasiological, it dismantles philosophical categories. And critical philosophical questions arise. Namely, concerning the human person. It raises the question of whether a world can be fundamentally organized against certain beings and what it means to exist within such a world. For example, if the category of the human can be historically withdrawn, disqualified, and redistributed, then affirmation cannot be immediate. It must take the form of a reclaiming. And so Césaire's definition of Negritude appears precise at this point, as a response to the condition in which being human has been rendered problematic. the recognition and acceptance of oneself is not a descriptive statement. It is a philosophical necessity produced by this history in which the self has been made unacceptable. And what emerging from Xavier Tank's earlier formulation is not only a description of colonial ideology whereby they claim, they consider that the enslaved is not a human person. So it is a profound destabilization of the philosophical categories through which we understand being, subjectivity, and humanity itself. The plantation does not merely oppress, it compels us to ask whether humanity can persist without recognition, whether the self can be inhabited when it is structurally disqualified, and whether the human itself can remain a universal category when it is historically denied. It is within this field of questions that Césaire's gesture must be situated as well. Negritude does not simply affirm what always was. It responds to the historical production of a condition in which this affirmation had become impossible. It's therefore not only an identity, but a philosophical act. So I said it was an act, and here it is a philosophical act, the reconstitution of the conditions under which one can say, I am, and be recognized as such. What emerges from this is that the plantasiological does not merely deny the humanity of the enslaved African. It places the very meaning of the human in question. If a being can be systematically positioned outside the category of the human while continuing to think, to act, to create, because this is what we're going to see later concerning the Africans, then the human can no longer be understood as a stable, self-evident category. It appears instead as something that can be historically withdrawn and redistributed. So the question is no longer only whether the enslaved are human, but what it means to be human at all under such conditions. And this is where the Africans are going to answer what it means to be human. It's not just what is human, but how do you perform humanity? And they will, and they continuously do perform humanity in the plantation. So is humanity defined by recognition? That's another question. By autonomy, by rationality, by the integrity of the body? Each of these criteria is precisely what the plantasiological seeks to deny or to dismantle, unsuccessfully. In this sense, the plantation produces not only domination, but a philosophical crisis. It forces a rethinking of the human from the standpoint of those whose humanity is denied. What do these Africans think of humanity? How do they exercise it? That is what the matter is about. It is within this space that a decisive shift occurs. The enslaved do not simply endure this disqualification through their practices, their acts, their thoughts, and their forms of life. They produce an answer to the question of the human, an answer that does not depend on recognition by the dominant order, but that emerges from persistence, relation, knowledge, creation, and refusal. The plantasiological produces a profound alienation of the self by disqualifying the enslaved as human, and by reorganizing the conditions under which one can appear as such. African practices are degraded, they are rendered infâme, they are subjected to systematic erasure. But in this sense, the subject is not only dispossessed, but displaced from himself. And progressively, we see that they inhabit a world in which their own modes of being no longer grant dignity or recognition. Yet, this alienation is not at all total. The same archive I've been working with so far also reveals persistently constant acts through which the enslaved refuse complete assimilation and maintain a relation to themselves that escapes the plantasiological capture. And this is what we're going to see now. I'm going to skip this to get into the conclusion. And so the plantation is a place where Negritude is performed before Césaire names it. It is the colonial archive that provides the answer to that. Jean-Baptiste Labat, the French missionary I mentioned earlier from the 18th century, is going to extract much of that out of the enslaved Africans concerning their experience, of which they are fully aware, and out of which they actually build a sort of science. Labat implicitly, it's through his writings that I can derive that. He implicitly sees and acknowledges that enslaved Africans possess experience, are conscious of it, and produce knowledge from it. For example, he's going to expatiate on the way an enslaved person has taken care of him when he was ill and used their knowledge, their skill and science for his own care, whether it concerns toothache, bellyache, headache, and so forth. Here, the enslaved subject appears as knower, healer, transmitter of technique. This is already incompatible with the ontological degradation required by the pentasociological. To think, to know, to act upon the body is in a system that defines one as property is not a minor detail. It's a contradiction at the heart of the system. And it is this very young enslaved person who is going to cure Jean-Baptiste Labat as he's suffering from multiple illnesses. If Negritude is, as Césaire says, a vigilant disposition of the mind, then this epistemic activity must be read as one of its earliest forms. Thinking under prohibition is already resistance. Producing knowledge, where one is supposed to be incapable of knowledge, is already a form of ontological refusal. Labat again notes that the enslaved tell him, when he seeks to know where they've learned all they do know, because they have skills, they have knowledge, and this is a science. So where does this come from? And they say, we don't know. Our old folks taught us. So here we see transmission here. So what appears here is not simply continuity, but continuity under conditions designed to break continuity. Enslavement attempts to sever lineage, memory, and cultural transmission. Yet practices, beliefs, and forms of knowledge circulate, persist, and reorganize themselves. If Negritude is a way to experience history within history, then this is precisely what we see here. History does not begin at the point of revolutionary rupture. It is lived, endured, transformed long before it becomes visible as an event. The enslaved are not waiting for history to begin. They are already living within it, already producing it, even when it is not recognized as such. Xavier Tonk, as to him, says, from the very moment they are sent into enslavement, these Africans have to get rid of their quality as human beings. And so here, this is a rough translation of the original. And so he describes the demand of the pentasociological, that the enslaved cease to be human. This is what the pentasociological requires of the Africans. Yet the same corpus reveals practices that directly contradict this demand. There's marronage, organized camps. We see how the different maroon camps communicate among and between one another. We see collective strategies being organized, for example. So these are structured forms of resistance that involve coordination, strategy, long-term planning. They are not mere reactions. They are forms of life. When Césaire defines Negritude as combat and revolt, he names something that is already operative here. The plantation is not only a site of domination, it is also a site in which resistance is constantly produced and enacted. Haiti amplifies this resistance. It concentrates and renders it historically undeniable. And so even at the level of language, where Moreau de Saint-Méry, who is one of the historians of the Caribbean from Martinique in the 18th century, talks about Creole. And what he says clearly shows the intervention of the Africans within this language. And so what he dismisses as jargon, he says it is a jargon. In fact, here, what we see, I'm not reading the quotation, is the creation of a linguistic system under extreme duress. This is not simply communication. It is a word in the making. It is word making. It is the production of meaning in a context that denies meaning. To create language where one's voice is structurally silenced is to enact what Césaire calls the offensive and active disposition of the mind. It is to refuse muteness. It is to insist on expression. Negritude in this sense is not only political or epistemological, it is linguistic. It is the capacity to generate meaning under conditions that deny one's right to speak. And so we also have this as a refusal in the area where Césaire says that Negritude is refusal. I'm going to skip this to return to Haiti from the origin to manifestation, actually, of Negritude. So when Césaire says that Negritude stood up in Haiti for the first time, so what stands up in Haiti is not something newly created. It is something that has long existed in fragmented, invisible forms, in the knowledge of the healer, in the transmission of practices, in the organization of marronage, in the creation of language, in the acts of refusal. What Haiti does is to gather these dispersed practices into a historical event that declares itself. It is the passage from lived experience to collective proclamation. Césaire does not need to be corrected. I'm not correcting Césaire. I'm simply extending Césaire. He names the moment when Negritude speaks. I'm showing the existence of that Negritude all along. What this means then, so if Negritude is not born in Haiti, but was made visible there, and I should say formal as well, because the Haitian revolutions can be seen as the formal way of expressing that Negritude, then it must be understood as a continuous process rather than a singular origin or a moment. It is not an invention of the 20th century, nor the exclusive product of revolutionary rupture. It is a mode of existence that emerges wherever human beings were subjected to ontological violence and yet continued to think, act, create, and refuse. What the archive reveals is not a repetition of resistance in different forms, but a differentiation of functions within a single structure. The enslaved persist in the sense that being does not disappear under its denial. They transmit in that practices, knowledge, and relations circulate despite systematic attempts at rupture. And they act in that refusal does not remain latent, but organizes itself within the very conditions that seek to suppress it. These are not equivalent gestures. Persistence concerns the level of being, transmission, the level of continuity, and action, the level of intervention. To collapse them into a single rhythmic series is to lose the specificity of each operation. Negritude does not consist in an undifferentiated series of refusals, combats, and revolts, but in a structured articulation Being persists under its denial, knowledge is produced under constraint, and action is organized within domination. In this sense, Césaire must be understood as an inheritor. What he names, like I showed, had already been lived, enacted, and sustained by those who, within the plantation, refused the disqualification of their being. The practices of persistence, the safeguarding of knowledge, the organization of resistance, and the continuous struggle to inhabit oneself within a structure designed to make this impossible constitute a historical continuity. Negritude does not begin, it is transmitted, it is displaced, it is reformulated. To think Césaire in terms of continuity has both practical and philosophical consequences. Practically, this restores the enslaved their full status as agents of history and thought. It refuses the implicit narrative in which dignity, consciousness, and affirmation would appear only at the moment of intellectual articulation or revolutionary visibility. Instead, it recognizes that these were already present, embodied in acts, gestures, and forms of life that came before their naming. Philosophically, this continuity transforms our understanding of negritude itself. It ceases to be a reactive identity or a compensatory affirmation emerging after loss. It appears instead as the explicit formulation of a structure that has already been at work. What Césaire accomplishes is not the creation of the structure, but its conceptual elevation, its passage from lived, often constrained practice to articulated thought. This situates Césaire precisely where he belongs, as the one who names, articulates, and amplifies a structure that precedes him, one that is rooted in the continuous refusal by the enslaved themselves to renounce either their humanity or their Africanly situated humanity. And thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Hanétha, for this very passionate lecture on negritude and the roots of negritude. So the floor is open now for questions, comments, and critique, if you want. Yeah, Abed.
Yeah. Hi, Hanétha.
Hello.
Yes, you're here. Yeah. So thank you very much. I have a question, and so it's a question of curiosity, but also would like to hear your reaction. So about this bodily experience of the enslaved person, which is actually your point of departure, and it's very interesting for me because your analysis is to me very phenomenological of this lived experience, and the role of body is very important. My question is, where is the zero point of departure? The point of departure of the experience is the bodily experience of the enslaved person, or this body is normally is considered to have a past. It means of, for example, the childhood of this body, for example, a form of bodily experience which is not necessarily enslaved, and in this case, is there a form of conflict between, let's say, body schema, the experience that the person has had actually as a child, and then comes into conflict? Because so listening to you, for me, this point of departure as this enslaved and to consider it ontologically was actually a little bit coherent in the sense of I can totally follow your argumentation, but I was interested to know do you consider this conflict a form of two different forms of bodily experience, once enslaved and once the person who has been enslaved as a body, I mean, before this enslavement? I hope it's clear.
This is an excellent question indeed. And so you said, where is the point zero of origin? Well, if we are to remain critically objective, the point zero of the origin of the enslaved Africans is Africa. They are extracted out of Africa. And therefore, this is the departing point, and where there is a marked experience with the body and through the body as well. So I am not suggesting that the plantation in and by itself is the point of critical and strict origin, not at all. And actually, these enslaved Africans are showing the contrary. This resistance comes from somewhere. What they are relying on to respond to this question concerning the human person and humanity is precisely what they know of themselves and of this humanity that they've experienced differently elsewhere. So, and I hope that this transpires somehow in what I showed here. That is what they are doing is to draw on something that in that context is ethical, and that something is their knowledge of what a human person is and of how to enact humanity. But this being said, we must also remember how complex the plantaciological is. The plantation, right, is extremely complex. And the existence of this African within that complex context is equally, utterly complex. There are Africans, individuals born and raised in Africa, and there are those of them who were born in the plantation and who will later on be called Creole. So these Africans could also be Creolized. They are Africans, not Creole, like their offspring, but they would certainly be Creolized to various degrees. But what I wanted to show is what remains of the ethics of the human they are carrying, and that they actually draw upon to respond and also intervene onto the plantaciological that has the pretense of dominating in a very absolute manner. The definition for the human person comes from it. The way of enacting it comes from it. That's the pretense of the plantaciological. And I'm showing that it is not so simple, because there is an African response. And this response is also derivative of this prior knowledge that they possess. So this possession has never been total, just like dehumanization never occurred. That is not true. We all have to stop saying Africans were they dehumanized us. We, for example, in America, the offspring of these Africans, are a living proof that it was not the case. We carry ethics, and I'm showing the production of that ethic here, this African ethic that is at the core of Caribbean thought. Had I answer the and had I understood your question in the first place?
Yeah.
You were asking about point of origin.
Yeah.
So you have this very complex thing that is happening, whereby there is an African intervention, there is the European very severe intervention, and there is the encounter of these two things in the site of the plantation that itself is also operating and having its own intervention to produce something. That something is Creole, right? And so Creole is another word for plantation. And this also is being at play here to make the experience of these Africans extremely, extremely complex. To maintain balance is not a given. That is one of the reasons why I believe it is fundamentally critical to study, to examine how they maintain balance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lindo has the next question.
Thank you very much for the incredibly deep presentation. I have struggled with the things we're talking about for quite some time now, so I was very, very happy to hear solutions to problems I had not even managed to articulate to myself as well. And so that leads me to I just have two interrelated questions. The first question pertains the speech act of asserting one's humanity. So I follow you when you talked about the conditions of possibility upon which the humanity of the African enslaved was enacted, and I think you spoke and talked about so humanity was never, Africans were never dehumanized. They always had their humanity, and they've always enacted their humanity, transmitted knowledge. They've always, even if the knowledge is delegitimized. And I think at some point, Césaire as well said something to the effect that the enslaved people always knew that their masters were lying, and referring to the discourse on the enslaved Africans. So that I follow very well. What I struggle with is the moment of utterance, where the utterance of humanity sort of, in my view, always presupposes a form of recognition. And I always wonder who then gets to recognize that humanity. Because when it is acted and practiced, it does not need recognition, as you said. I mean, you can always enact a humanity without recognition. But for me, the moment of utterance, if it's not within ourselves, but if it's something else or someone else, even as a form of resistance, implies a recognition that, in my view, gives power to those who must recognize it. And it's usually those who deny it in the first place. And I've always struggled with that ambivalence, and I don't know what to think about it. And the interrelated question is also with the concept of humanity, where Césaire also says, well, do we want to use the category human as those who have used it against us? And we've seen those people who've said they're humans and we don't have humanity, and we've watched how they've acted against the very ideals of humanity that they say we have, they deny from us. And I think at some point there was also, among post-colonial theory, talks about the very concept of humanity, and you've mentioned this briefly, that some people sort of have this kind of resistance of thinking maybe this even the very concept of humanity itself is something that we want to move beyond. So I don't know what you think of those two things.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the first question concerns the moment of utterance of this humanity or enactment of humanity that would need to be recognized by another party, that would need to also experience recognition. Is that what you said? Did I rephrase your question? Or you can do it yourself. You can.
No, enacting and practicing humanity is fine. For me, it's the speech acts of asserting one's humanity to those who deny it, which produces a form of sort of.
There are words that I don't get in what you said. Just there, if you could repeat the last line you said, because there were a few words that I couldn't receive.
The acting and the enacting of humanity does not need recognition, as you've convincingly argued. I was talking about the moment where Césaire picks it up then to the speech act, the act of speaking and declaring one's humanity, writing about one's humanity. That seems to me to presuppose an audience that must recognize your humanity. And for me, that seems to produce an ambivalence that denies the very thing that the African enslaved wanted to resist.
Yeah, and well, I think this is this can be approached from the what I was talking about earlier, the complexity of the plantation, and so by demonstrated what I've just proposed here doesn't abolish all the other phenomena of the plantation. My point is to show that this too is happening here. And I agree with you at the level of recognition, there are issues. And so to revert to one thing you said concerning Césaire, who reminds us that the enslaved know that the enslaver is alive, this is founded on multiple discourses on the part of the enslaved within the plantation. Multiple speeches, multiple words, they say. For example, when they are accused of something or they are insulted, they would just tell the enslaver, well, you are accusing me of being a liar. I am not white. They would say that. Or you accuse me of being a liar. You accuse me of having stolen something. Well, I am not white. You have that in the archive. So knowledge and lucidity about the experience, objectivity, all of these are present. And therefore, when it comes to the question of defining humanity in a different way than the plentasociological and experiencing it through enactment, they actually are not seeking recognition. They will not have recognition from the plentasociological. This is out of the question. That is not in the interest of the plentasociological. But when you consider the various acts that are constantly repeated, the words that you find from one archive to the other and so forth, you also extract the this idea that this is not a concern on the part of these Africans, that there be recognition of this enactment of humanity here on the part of the enslaving regime. At the same time, there are also multiple facts that show this, this, I would say, propensity, because you find it a lot as well in the archives, to actually receive implicitly or explicitly on the part of the enslaver a form of recognition. And so the terms of the plentasociological make it extremely, extremely complicated and hard for the enslaved under this duress to not seek for forms of recognition on the part of the enslaver at times, or perhaps even quite often. But when you look at the question of spontaneously performing humanity in a way that is radically at variance with that of the enslaver, you don't see that there is an aim to bring the enslaver to say they are human. It's not that explicit. It doesn't transpire legibly, at least within the archives, at least those with which I do work. So here I would be tempted to say preliminary that while the question of recognition is so critically important in that phenomenon, obtaining it in that very specific context is not an objective and not a necessity for the immediacy of the experience. What appears important to me is what comes after, is the future. It's like, what do we do with that now that they performed it, they enacted it, and they actually formalized it? We have it today. This is what matters. We recognize it. So I've been able to do that work, to identify it through the archive and start thinking about it and realizing, oh my goodness, this is Negritude, right? And we could have used another word. That's the one Césaire used, and I chose to work with it as well because he defines it in a specific way that actually echoes what I'm seeing unfolding in the plantation. So I would rather place that shift to our present times, because the recognition that would be necessary for this African enactment of humanity within the plantation to become something spectacularly formal to the eyes of the plantasiological is, not going to take place. So the fundamental question is the time of recognition, which brings us to the question of deferment. So everything is deferred. That means later. Freedom, it's later. Oh yeah, they will be, freed. We can free them, but let's teach them first. They don't know what freedom is, like later. Justice, yeah, we owe them something, but like they wouldn't know what to do with what we owe them. So let's later. It's deferment. So there's also a deferment of recognition, but that deferment doesn't have to be something negative, because today we can draw upon it. There is an African intervention here that is fundamental for the question of not only the human person, but also humanity and humankind. What do we do with it today?
Thank you, Hanétha. The next question comes from Rutte. Rutte, can you try to speak up?
Yeah. Hi, Hanétha. Thanks so much for your inspiring lecture. So powerful to hear you different reference to connect in us. Professor Achille Mbembe, for example, in Brazil, Quebegale Munanga, or Jamila Ribeiro, for example. And another important reference has Grada Quilomba. Yeah. When you define negritude, your concept of negritude, for example, you make her to understand that the rules of negritude is in plantation and orality. In this perspective, I think that you connected hers, your concept of negritude is so close of Americanity in perspective of Leila Gonzalez, especially when Gonzalez defined that, considered that the Black Brazilian woman was historically the guardian of culture of resistance in context of America, especially in Brazil. In this way, Professor, I would like to hear you about the experience of in Caribbean when we observe that orality and performance of woman in plantation context was strategy of resistance, and in this way, it's important to observe that the woman in context of slavery, they not only anticipate the negritude present in Césaire in 20th century, but also this woman, they created the base for epistemological, for the colonial epistemic, for example, so important to in front of Eurocentrism, for example. What did you think about this question? I don't know if I was, yeah.
Okay, so thank you. So the question concerns the contribution of women within this framework of negritude within the pentasiological, or does it concern something else? Did I understand well what you mean? I understand that you drawing on the on the feminine contribution, but I'm not understanding clearly the core of the question you asking.
Yeah, Professor, exactly the contribution of a woman in a context of plantation, for example, before the Negritude has a philosophical term to observe, for example, base for the colonial theory, for example, or Afrocentric perspective.
Mm-hmm. So yes, I know that there is there is an instinct to systematically seek to understand the very specific gender proposition or intervention within that particular frame of history. And while I do work on women very much and on certain questions, I don't necessarily focus on genderizing all the questions I approach. And in this particular framework, I did not. But there certainly are women specific interventions within Caribbean plantations. And by saying that, I also want to remain prudent because we tend to also say the Caribbean, while we do know that because of colonization, there are distinctions, and these are colonial distinctions, which very often cannot be bypassed because in one form of colonization, say the French one, there would be certain phenomena, and on others, say that of the Spanish or the Portuguese, there would be other forms of manifestations, even though we're still dealing with the same object, which is colonization. So I'm always very prudent when talking about the Caribbean in this broad sense. That's why I very specifically most often focus on the way the French have conducted colonization and enslavement at the same time in this space of America. And so I would be prudent in generalizing like that, in the same way as I also want to be prudent in genderizing systematically certain questions, because here I am dealing with the question of thought. What I did through that work, what I'm doing, because it's an ongoing work, actually is to show where Africans have produced thought in a context, in a system where they were not supposed to. I mean, the system was claiming that, they are objects, they are machines, there are two things, they are beasts and machines, right? So apparently beasts don't think and machines certainly not. So we are being told, the plantasiological tells us that these are beasts and machines, and they can talk, can produce thought. And so I am concentrating on that production. We know how critical their capacity to enrich parts of Europe materially has been, and we know less about their thoughts, about how they actually produced philosophy. And so because this is my object, I look at for the case of Martinique, for example, I look at the experience in a global way. And for certain questions, I focus on gender, which is another aspect of the work I do. And so I am afraid here I will not be able to extract a very specific contribution of women, for instance, in this particular phenomenon of producing definition and action that eloquently show that actually they are working, they're living with, and they're existing with their definition of what a human person is and how to perform that, how to live it, how to enact it. So perhaps this is something I should tackle now that you mention in it. So, and I would be happy to consider that. I'm sure there are things to actually learn. There are critical knowledge to extract from that as well. I am very sorry to disappoint here.
Thank you, Hanétha. Next question comes from Sanya Osha. Please try to speak up so she can.
Where's the microphone?
You don't have the microphone.
Thank you so much for your very eloquent rendition of Aimé Césaire's formulation of negritude. It's quite interesting to see that his conception of it, it's quite different from his colleagues, such as Léopold, Sédar, Senghor. So I'd like to know, for instance, how Césaire's formulation differs from Sédar, Senghor's formulation. This is quite important. I'd also like to know your reactions to the famous retort of Wole Soyinka to the idea of negritude, saying a tiger does not proclaim its tigritude, it pounces. So there are quite a lot of detractors to negritude. And so I'd like to know some of your reactions to those critiques and criticisms. One, and secondly, I'd like you to talk more on the place of France in the formulation of the concept of negritude, because all of them, that's Aimé Césaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, and then also Léon contra Damas, were all in France. So France plays a lot of a major role in the formulation of the concept. So if you could tie that into your discussion, I think it would give us a richer picture of this very interesting concept. So the detractors, the place of Sédar, Senghor, and France.
Okay, all right, so the detractors, yeah. Okay, so perhaps I should start with France, the place of France. I mean, so these are three colonial subjects, colonized, I mean, who were formed, trained, and brought up by terms of the French colonization. So it's only logical that France would have a part, even a critical part, in their formulation and conception, whether methodologically, whether in terms of content and so forth, and certainly in terms of their collective experience, you know, of negritude. In the first of all, they all were in France, in the heart of France, in Paris, when doing that. So geographically speaking, it carries this weight as well. But much more than that, what carries true weight is their experience as colonial subjects of French racism. So it plays a part here. France plays a critical part there. It's a racism that, in the case of Martinique, that started to be expressed in 1635, the year when Martinique became, or the year when France intruded in the affairs of the Arawaks who lived there. So there is a definite French component to be considered as well, in addition to the fact that formally they were trained by the French system. So it is because of that Negritude was expressed in the way they did. If we consider Damas, for instance, who, by the way, is systematically forgotten, while he's the very first one to have ever published on behalf of Negritude. It's not Césaire, but Damas. So we should actually always start with him, but somehow he is discarded and we forget about him. So if we consider Damas's Negritude, which is very intense and dense, much more than that of Césaire, we understand the part that France played in that formulation very, very, very well. Because the density of Damas corresponds to the density of the racism they're experiencing. And that prompts this formulation of Negritude, which is self-defense. I didn't talk about it here, but Negritude is also self-defense against an attack on their selves as persons, and persons who come from this particular cultural paradigm, the Caribbean paradigm, one that suffered from both colonization and enslavement. As to Senghor and the African critique of Césaire's perspective on Negritude, the tiger and the zebra that do not actually shed their particularities and so forth. We don't need to. I want to say that one of the critical points to also place at the center of consideration is the cultural paradigm within which both sets of thinkers here operate. So there's one set which is Caribbeano-American, it's Damas and Césaire, and the other set that's African. And within the African set, there is the French-speaking and English-speaking particularities. So Césaire and Damas are of Africa. They are sons of Africans, while Senghor is from Africa. And so here in their respective Negritude, we see that being transparent. The historical experience is not the same. In the Caribbean, in America, we experienced enslavement. That was not the case. We experienced American enslavement, colonial enslavement. That was not the case on the African continent. We did experience colonization as well. In Africa, there was colonization without enslavement in the way enslavement was experienced. And that is a major difference. And both Césaire and Damas think with that, which is not the case of Senghor. They think with all of the afterlives, all of the profound consequences of having to have been shaped by both systems. And so Senghor speaks very much of métissage, which is not the case of Damas and Césaire at all. While they are supposed to be Creole, right? They are supposed to be fundamentally métissés, racially, culturally, and so forth. So there we see a tension, which is not a negative tension, but a tension nonetheless. And I believe it's due partly to that experience. It's not the same experience, the experience of being of Africa and from Africa. And as to those who whom you've referred from the English-speaking part of Africa, it's also, to my mind, partly due to that difference, whereby an African may not necessarily completely understand what it means to come from a group that was enslaved in this way in this part of the world. It's not the same dynamic at all. And that dynamic produces thought and emotion, because affect is fundamentally important. I deal with emotion, and I refuse the European paradigm that pretend that it is not important. It is at the core of everything, because emotion led enslavement. It is also partly, or perhaps largely, because of an excessive emotion that enslaved was enslaved. It's not only because of economical reasons. It's because there was this feeling that one was superior. It's emotion. And that led to fear, another emotion with which enslavers did conduct enslavement. Fear expressing itself through various forms. Fear of the other, fear of being poor, fear of not being affluent, fear of not representing supremacy, and so forth. So emotion is very much part of the question of enslavement. And so in multiple forms, so I also consider it. And the emotion that the history of enslavement may derive on the part of those who spring from that experience may not necessarily be identical to the type of emotion that colonization alone brings about Africans, for example. So we have two sets of emotions, one concerning colonization, one concerning enslavement, that we carry. And colonization is not enslavement. They coincide. One feeds the other, and they are intertwined in this vicious and copulative circle that never stops turning on itself and reproducing its own self through and by its own elements. So it's a very bizarre machine, but colonization is not enslavement. And we are very much aware of it. When you are of Africa and you come from the Caribbean, that is a knowledge we carry, and it is also a consciousness that we carry. And so it may be part of the answer to your question, along the myriad of other reasons that may have brought about such critique.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hanétha. You answered already my own question, which would also be about the relation between the African representatives of Negritude and the Caribbean representatives of Negritude, but this is what you answered already. I have still three people on my note here who want to ask a question. This is Priyanka, then Jose Castiano, and Dorothy Oluwakbemi Jacob. Bitte schön, Priyanka.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I got very curious to know about the gender, like it's related to what Ruth asked. But I would be curious to know if you've come across collective women writing or women participants in the larger shaping of Negritude movement and also as a way of thinking. And most recently, like in 2015, there was a wonderful roundtable led by Glenda Sluga on history of women activism. And she was talking about the role of Nardal sisters in France, who were instrumental in terms of raising the questions of the Negritude movement. A problem, I mean, when we are talking about meta movement, big movements, especially movements related to human emancipation, unfortunately, the framing of these movements are largely in masculine etymologies. So we have these three male big thinkers who are instrumental in bringing this idea and way of thinking. But it would be difficult for me to not really find women who were associated and played important role. So your response on this. Thank you.
Yes, you're talking, so you're talking about the 20th century Negritude. Of course, this is established now that Paulette Nardal and Jeanne Nardal, the sisters, and the others, because there were quite a number of them, actually staged the conditions and created the conditions for Negritude to emerge, offering the space, but also thought. And this is now established. I mean, we can go back and pretend that Negritude comes from solely Damas, Césaire, and Senghor. So the Sœur Nardal are very much part of this epistemology and history. Now, concerning Paulette Nardal herself, she is so contradictory and ambivalent to me that I personally have difficulty dealing with certain of her ideas, because she was reactionary, and even as a feminist, and very much a French product in a way neither Césaire nor Damas were. And so there is this this gray zone here that personally, this is personal, but you do have other scholars who are going to tell you the contrary and actually promote Paulette Nardal's ideas. But while I do work on Paulette Nardal and Jeanne Nardal, essentially for her Black internationalism, this is Jeanne Nardal, I am still ill at ease with Paulette Nardal. What one cannot do is to contest the fact that indeed she is the one who staged Negritude. And she did it in a very thoughtful way, and she did it in a very broad way. She was a practitioner of Black internationalism, while Césaire, for instance, because they both are from Martinique, was not so intensely so. But she actually, the work she did, the fact that she had the journal, and she insisted in writing in English as well to reach out to the English-speaking fellows. And she constantly read what came from other parts of the Black world at the time. And she corresponded with virtually all of these African-American thinkers of the time. She went to La Sorbonne and met with Anna Cooper, right? We were in the 20s, and so she is fundamental. But beyond that, her ideas, so to me, reactionary. So you need to read Une femme dans la cité that she directed when she went back to Martinique to understand her ideas. She was in favor of la departementalisation in 46 that got Martinique to become a French department. She ferociously defended la départementalisation, while Martinique could have been one of the first, if not the first, to become independent, because that was already 1946. She is a precursor of decolonization, because départementalisation was also to some extent fought along that line of decolonizing Martinique. And I don't believe that India was already at that time decolonized formally, politically. But no, that didn't happen. We became a French department. And so there are all of these questions as well. So I think So there again, I remain prudent when dealing with what I see as a trend of systematically genderized thing, and I believe it's very important to consider certain questions in terms of gender because of the long history of sexual and gender sexism and domination. And in this particular question, I would have so much to say concerning the experience of African women who are enslaved in the plantation of America and their offspring today, because if we're going to talk about genderizing questions and perspectives, their case is a case not to be missed. And so, so I recognize the value of that, but still always trying to remain as prudent as I can. Because to me, the question is about justice. And what haunts me is that I could participate through the ideas I shape and disseminate through my my work to injustice, to creating things that never existed, actually.
Professor Castiano, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I am Castiano from Mozambique. So I will talk slowly so that my English can be understood. So I have 2 comments and 1 question. The first comment is that I think Negritude was a platform to articulate the objective and subjective pain of being victim of racism. And racism is a common ground when we want to talk about this, whether Afro-diasporian revolutions, resistance, reactions, but also African one. So that's just a comment, because when we talk about plantation, that concept, we also have a concept for plantations, plantações in Portuguese. Or if you go to Angola, it's sanzalas. And the kind of punishment, body punishment, they were more or less the same. So it is difficult to have a dialogue because of that, and that is my second comment, to know the origin of those movements like Negritude, Pan-Africanism. I think those 2 movements, that is my second comment, they are multipolar. If let's say I've been working on Pan-Africanism, so the Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki, for instance, last 2 weeks, he spoke that Pan-Africanism was originally in South Africa through a religious movements in 19th century. So I think in that way we have to have more dialogue about who started where, which started, and what were different influences between Africa and Afro-diaspora in America or Brazil in this case. Yeah, I think that is a research question that Glofi is now making for us. But my last question is that where do you draw continuity and discontinuity between Negritude and Pan-Africanism?
Okay. Yes, I think yes, Negritude is also a platform to articulate what you said, pain, objective and subjective. You said pain, emotion. I'm reverting to that, like anger that Césaire talks about as well. The anger and the type of choice he makes towards anger, what he's going to allow anger to do to him or to bring him to do. Is it going to be an ethical anger or ethical anger? So it's a way to express that and to act upon what the historical experience and its aftermath are provoking. So yeah, I agree with you. Same concerning Pan-Africanism, it's multiple. I don't believe one necessarily need to state a point of origin and thereby fix it in a sort of paralyzing rigidity, while it is something that's movable as we can be witnesses of. I could also say that, I mean, when Africans are extracted out of Africa and poured onto the American colonies, then what happens there is a sort of unity of Africa, a Pan-Africanism too, whereby you have the Hausas and the Ewes and the Yorondos and the Wolof and the a way who come together and produce life together and beyond life existence together. So this in itself is a form of Pan-Africanism here. So we don't necessarily need to mark it through a rigid point of origin. Maybe what we could do is to acknowledge the existence of both the thought and practice of being and getting together for the sake of ethics and justice. And so do we also necessarily need to consider the relations or relationship even between Pan-Africanism and Negritude in terms of continuity and discontinuity? Or is it epistemologically, but also philosophically more appropriate to consider them from the point of view of phenomena emerging from certain groups under certain circumstances for a certain objective or purpose? The objective I always refer to is justice. I mean, a fundamental injustice has been exerted. It demands justice. So the phenomena that comes out of us, to me, should be towards that aim of obtaining justice. And whether it's through Negritude or Pan-Africanism. And therefore, these phenomena cannot sever ties with ethics and integrity and loyalty to the objective of finding balance, justice being a form of it, right? So I don't know whether drawing a line in terms of continuity and discontinuity, convergences and divergences between these is judicious.
Thank you, Hanétha. The last question comes from Dorothy.
Thank you, Hanétha. I found that lecture very interesting and thought-provoking. Now, I got from your lecture that Negritude was a response to the objective conditions prevalent in the plantation. the experiences of the enslaved. And from your topic, you are talking about thinking the movement beyond the 20th century. We are now in the 21st century. So what would you consider the focus of Negritude?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for taking me back to my title. Actually, thinking Negritude beyond, but also what I showed is, you see, the past of Negritude, or some people may say the origin, or you know, the starting point. And I don't know whether it's an origin or a starting point, as someone asked the question earlier, but I know it actually was performed within the plantation, and the plantation was at one point in time. Therefore, that's why I'm bringing the notion of time here, which I didn't develop, but I do in the longer work I do about that. So this is a little, you know, a bit the framework within which I reasoned that. And for today, the title of that is Longue Durée Négritude and the beyond, thinking beyond it. But it's also thinking plantation thought, the enslaved practices, and the continuity of being, because as someone who is of Africa, from America, I'm from Martinique, we continuously told about discontinuity and the rupture with Africa constantly. I mean, that's what we should actually internalize as a fact, an objective fact, that there's no connection anymore, and if there is any, it's faint. While it is not true, this is not what we do experience. So I am dealing with that question and that imposition through thought, producing the thought that would actually respond to that here. And so thinking Negritude for beyond the time when it was produced in this way, in the 20th century, it concerns the question of futurity. And this is what we more and more developing as an idea, actually, especially concerning Africa. And so I think today we're talking more about, I'm reverting to the previous question, Pan-Africanism than Negritude. I think I am among the very few still using the word Negritude, because I believe we still have not actually done it. We still have not performed it. And I'm thinking in terms of my geographical origin. I mean, in the part of the world where I'm from, we're supposed to have passed that moment and be into that of being Creole and of creolization. And I am saying you won't get to creolization, which you're presenting as the ideal ontology to embrace, until you've performed and you've actually inhabited Negritude. We still have not done it. So to me, we can skip it. We can skip that moment, even though everything around us suggests that we've passed that moment. When you study phenomena that happen in Martinique, for example, whether socially, politically, culturally, you see it's not true at all, because confusion reigns. So there is something happening here, and I am saying we've missed the step we were to take towards balance. Therefore, balance is compromised. We need to slow down and take the time with rigor, patience, and seriousness to look into our productions. And so Pan-Africanism is compromised if I consider the way it's articulated in its definition currently. If Negritude is not actually lived. I'm talking about Martinique here. I am not generalizing. So beyond that, what we need to do to answer your question is to actually go back a little in time, reconsider Negritude, actually study it. Studying it implies studying the phenomena around it. I mean, the world was moving at the time. We're in the 30s. What was happening? And then we've had the 40s and the 50s and so forth. And I'm being told that we don't have time because the world is marching. We can't pause. And it's marching with such a rapidity that we're going to be completely lost and also at a loss if we take this due time to consider where we are at right now. If our principle is to obtain justice, obtain and live and exist through balance. So Negritude beyond Negritude, to me, is that. It's taking the time to know Negritude in the first place.
Sentence for our event today. Yeah, Hanétha, thank you so much for your stimulating lecture and for your patience to answer all the questions here. It is time now to close. Let's thank our speaker with the last round of. Yeah, and next week, same time as usual, 2 p.m., there will be a double lecture by 2 distinguished scholars, by Magdalena Kraus, who comes from Austria, talking, but is a specialist in Latin American feminist theory, and our colleague Aposede Ibadiola will present on African feminist theory and activism. This is the plan for next week. I hope we can see all of you back. Tomorrow morning, unfortunately, there will be no research talk, given the conditions we have here now. So unfortunately, tomorrow, no research talk, but next week, we will meet here for another lecture by 2 feminist scholars. Thank you so much. And yeah, don't forget, there is another lecture today. Priyanka will give another talk at 6 p.m. in the building with the name N, like North, in room 09. So whoever would like to listen to Priyanka, there's another chance, last chance, because Priyanka will leave us at the end of this week. So thanks for today, and yeah, have a nice evening.
It is.